Hello guys, my name is Rowan Smith and I want to welcome you to the Training for Mountaineering podcast. Now this podcast is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare and conquer your upcoming mountaineering adventure. Once a week, I'm going to be sharing with you in-depth and evidence-backed information around improving your physical performance on the mountain, reducing your likelihood of pain and injury, nutrition for mountaineers, and even a bit of mental strength development, so you can be empowered in your training to give yourself the very best chance of a safe, enjoyable, and successful mountaineering adventure. So now that you know what you're in for, let's get into today's episode. Hello guys, today we are talking all about knee pain for mountaineers. Now knee pain is probably one of the most common complaints I hear from mountaineers, and it can affect almost anyone from beginner mountaineers leading up into their first expedition to lifelong mountaineers who have done some of the biggest peaks in the world. It is such a common thing and it's an absolute plague to the mountaineering community. So today we're going to be talking through a few very, very important points around knee pain prevention, which I use with my clients, which hopefully can help prevent knee pain affecting both your training and your performance, as well as helping minimize it if you are experiencing it already. Now, the reason why knee pain is so common for mountaineers is that mountaineers are exposed to a few really, really big risk factors when it comes to this specific type of pain. Now, number one, probably the major thing when it comes down to this is endurance sports, such as mountaineering, running, whatever, just has a lot of training load, meaning you're doing long periods of exercise again and again and again and again. And endurance athletes have a tendency just to overdo it and just do way too much. Unfortunately, every single type of exercise we do comes with some type of load which puts stress through the joints. Now, this can be good stress or it can be bad stress. Good stress in the sense if you're doing enough to stimulate the body to get fitter, stronger, and more resilient. Bad stress in the sense if you do too much and the body can't recover in between bouts of exercise and it starts to go the other way. It starts to get pain, injury, starts to break down and all of that. Now, endurance sports, just because you're doing so much, it is very, very hard often to find the balance between the good and the bad. And mountaineers specifically, who just like to go and go and go and go, it does put them at a relatively high risk of joint pain, whether it's foot, chin, knee, or back, or whatever. But today we're talking about knee, and that's probably the biggest contributing factor. Number two, another really big factor is purely descents. Now, going downhill, whether you're walking, hiking, running, puts a huge amount of extra pressure on the joints. I think when you're hiking downhill without any load on your back, the knee takes almost 6 times more force than it does when you're walking on the flat. Now, add that to the fact that if most mountaineers can be carrying a loaded pack in their training in one way or another, which puts a huge amount of extra force through the joints, add that to the fact that many mountaineers like to run, and running downhill repeatedly can put a bunch more force through the joints, can really add up into, a bit of a tricky situation. Again, if the body is strong enough and stable enough and can handle these loads, that's perfectly fine. But if it's not, and you're doing too much that the body cannot handle, it just puts way too much pressure through the joints and it can eventually lead to a bit of pain. Now, the third big risk factor is that mountaineers as a whole are just not a huge fan of strength training. Now, as I've said in a previous podcast, strength training is the single best thing you can do to be preventing injury. And when it comes down to knee pain, it's probably the single most important thing you can be doing to prevent this type of pain. But unfortunately, mountaineers as a whole in general aren't really massive fans of strength training. They don't put a huge amount of effort into it, and I know a lot of people skip this altogether. On top of that, the strength training that many mountaineers are familiar with, where it's purely just aimed at improving performance and getting strong for the mountain, might not be specifically helping them prevent and stabilize their knee to reduce knee pain. And we're going to be exploring that a little bit further. And then finally, there's just minimal education around this subject, meaning if you plug in knee pain for mountaineers into Google, you're not going to really get many quality results. There'll be a bit of information, but most of it is pretty average in all honesty. And most mountaineers, when they do have an issue like this, they'll go to Google in the first place and they'll try to find an answer. And if they can't find an answer, they'll just carry on as usual. Now, obviously, there's always the option of going to the physiotherapist and getting a diagnosis and treatment there, which I strongly recommend anyone who is dealing with pain and injury go about that. That's the best thing you can possibly do. But we know that a lot of people are resistant to going to a physiotherapist for all the aches and pains. We also know that a lot of people struggle to put in to apply the information, the exercises and the stretches or whatever that a physiotherapist gives over the long term. And a lot of people just don't see the results they need from that. So today we're just going to be talking through my particular system of helping prevent knee pain for mountaineers. So if you are in this situation, you can have a little bit more knowledge around preventing this type of pain so you can fully perform in your training and on the mountain and fully enjoy yourself as well. Now, as I said before, knee pain for mountaineering really can affect just about everyone. Now, two classic examples at the very, very far ends of the scales are two clients that I've worked with previously through my online training. Now, the first example is a bloke who was in his late 20s and he was gearing up for his first mountaineering expedition over in Nepal. And he was doing a little bit of type of training, but he was just getting some serious knee pain. And that was coming on from he was doing long days on his feet at work. He was a roofer. He was doing running for his training. He was really struggling with that. And he was just dealing with all this knee pain. And it was really, really stressing him out, thinking that he just couldn't prep for this upcoming expedition and that he couldn't get through the training he needed, that he couldn't get through the technical courses he needed, and that he would really, really struggle when he was actually on the mountain. And in his situation, it was purely for the fact that he just didn't know what he was doing here. He had no experience around preventing knee pain, and that was compounded by the fact that he just didn't have much experience on the mountain. So he wasn't sure whether this was really going to severely hold him back or not. On the other end of the scale was another mountaineer I was working with who was a lifelong mountaineer who'd been mountaineering for a good 20 years or something like that. She'd done multiple 8,000 meter plus peaks and she was really, really experienced. But she was also struggling with long-term knee pain. And it got to the stage where even though she knew she could push through her training, she could push through her guiding because she was also a guide with this type of knee pain, it was really, really getting in the way of her improving her performance and prepping for these big mountains and also her work. And she was stressed about that. Now, these two mountaineers are at complete opposite ends of the scales. We had a first-time mountaineer and a lifelong mountaineer, but they both had the same issue and pretty much the same solution to their knee pain, which got in the way of their expeditions. And as they came through the process, as they applied all the stuff I'm about to talk about, as they worked through the entire system, they really saw some major changes to their appearance of pain. They saw some really major changes to their comfort during their training, and when they're actually on the mountain, they noticed a big difference. So we're just going to be exploring exactly what we did there. Now, if you have followed my stuff for a while, you'll know that dealing with knee pain for adventure athletes is a huge part of what I do every single week, and it is something which I consider myself pretty good at. But to be clear, I'm not a physiotherapist and I do not pretend to be one, so I don't diagnose issues. I don't deal with acute injuries like if you've just blown out your knee or done your ACL or just had a reconstruction. That's not for me and that's not what we're talking about today. What I'm good at is helping people who are further along and outside that acute phase of injury, who struggle with mild knee pain in their training, hiking and mountaineering, and they want to get to a stage where they can perform at their best and also enjoy the experience for what it is. So with all that being said, what we're going to be covering today are 4 big areas around preventing knee pain for mountaineers. We're going to be covering mobility training, strength training, exercise choice, and workload. And these 4 things really, really play big into the preventing knee pain for mountaineers. So to kick things off, let's talk mobility. Now, before we get into the details here, I need to give you a very, very short anatomy lesson so you'll understand where I'm coming from. Now, in the body, your joints, in general, want to be one of 2 things. They either want to be stable or they want to be mobile. Now, your knee joint is a joint that really wants to be stable in its natural sense. So aside from the usual flexing and extending that it does day to day, it doesn't really want a huge amount of extra movement through that joint. There will always be a little bit, but we more or less want to minimize that. On the other hand, your ankles and your hips, so the joints below and above your knee, they want to be mobile, meaning they want to have quite a big range of motion. They want to move freely, and they just want to be happy moving around day to day. Now, unfortunately, for a huge amount of mountaineers out there, both their ankles and their hips tend to get really, really tight. And unless you have a history of hypermobility or you have a history of ankle injuries, this is probably going to be you. Now, this is caused from a whole bunch of different things out there. From the hips, it's from sitting down all day at work, on the desk, on the couch, in our cars. Just sitting all day does cause a bit of restriction through the hips. From our ankles, it's from wearing, dodgy shoes. Most people are wearing, heeled footwear. Guys, girls like to wear thongs and flip-flops. From lots of running, from lots of dancing. There's a whole bunch of different things that can lead in to ankles getting restricted. But basically, these two joints tend to get relatively tight. And when it comes into knee pain, these joints tend to be quite significantly tight. And basically what happens is when we're walking, when we're running, when we're doing any type of movement, if the body can't find movement in the ankles and the hips, which should be mobile, it'll try to find movement somewhere else. And what happens is it'll allow more movement through the knee joint. And that really is often a big contributor to pain. So in order to help fix this, if you do have restricted ankles or hips and you are getting pain through your knees, you want to be putting a big emphasis into loosening up those ankles and those hips. So how I generally do this is I try to apply 3 different things. So the first thing is regular foam rolling or self-myofascial release. So this will be done with a foam roller, with a hard ball of some type, with a water bottle, whatever. Most people are pretty familiar with this these days. You can find foam rollers pretty much anywhere on the internet, any store and any gym. They're pretty effective at helping release the muscles in the short term. Now, it won't make long-term changes to mobility and it won't change the structure of your muscles, but it can loosen things off in the short term, so it can be pretty effective there. Now, there is a bit of debate around how they actually work, but basically everyone knows that they work. They just don't understand how they do it. And getting into the science behind that is a little bit beyond this podcast today, but just take it as a whole that they can be effective at releasing muscles in the short term. So basically by spending a little bit of time each day foam rolling the calves and also getting into the hips can be relatively effective. So the calves you can generally do with a foam roll or a water bottle. For the hips, you might have to get a ball, whether it's a tennis ball or a cross ball or something harder like that. That can be a really, really great method of just giving a little bit of release to these joints. Now, on top of that, you want to be doing regular stretching. Now, standard stretching, which I'm sure you've done in the past and most mountaineers are pretty familiar with, is pretty old school and not incredibly effective. This involves just finding a nice stretch and holding that for maybe 20 to 30 seconds and just doing this every once in a while. You'll probably do this at the end of a workout. You just do a few random stretches. You might do this when you're feeling particularly tight. It'll feel good and help relax things, but it's not really going to do a huge amount for long-term mobility. So what you want to be doing if you are trying to make a change in mobility in your joints is you want exposure. You want to be trying to get lots and lots of stretching, lots of mobility work through the week. So you might just do 2, 3, 4 times a week of holding these stretches for a minute at a time, a couple of times. You might take all your rest periods in your strength training and making sure you're doing stretches in there. You might be making sure you're doing specific warm-ups before your training. And you might be making sure you have a little routine before you go to bed or when you're in front of the TV. And just making sure you get lots of exposure to stretching in the calves and the hips, because it does take a long time to change mobility and it does take a lot of exposure. So if you are trying to go down this route, you do need to be smart about this and don't just expect a few random stretches are going to help. And then the third area around this, which I just mentioned before, which really is neglected and not very well done by mountaineers, at least from what I've seen, is warming up properly before training. Now, this doesn't mean just doing a bit of core work or just doing a run and counting that as a warm-up. What it means is before you start training or heading out for a day on an expedition when you're actually on the mountain, is spending 5 minutes mobilizing your hips and your ankles. This can really, really go a long way. So whether you're getting a water bottle out and doing a little bit of rolling, whether you're doing a few particular stretches. Now, the reason behind this is if you just go out on the trail and you haven't warmed up properly, that first half an hour before you warm up properly from just walking or running or whatever it may be, that's going to be putting a bit of pressure through those joints. And if you start off the day badly, it's just going to not end well. So spending 5 minutes at the start of a training session doing specific mobility or the start of a day on the trail doing specific mobility can really, really go a long way. And as I said before, unless you have a history of hypermobility, you probably do need to be mobilizing and you do need to apply this into your training. So that's step number 1, and that's mobility training for preventing knee pain for a mountaineer. Step number 2, and probably just as important, or if not more important, is strength training. Now, strength training is something that every single mountaineer needs to be doing. And specifically for knee pain, strengthening up the stabilizing muscles of the knee is incredibly important for knee pain prevention. So which muscles stabilize the knee and which do you need to be strengthening? Well, the main areas you want to be targeting are the quads, the glutes, and to a lesser extent, the hamstrings. All of these muscles play a really important role in stabilizing the knee, absorbing force, and simply allowing your knee to keep happy. Now, one big mistake I see from mountaineers with this is they're perfectly happy working on their quads, so doing endless squats, lunges, and step-ups. And most mountaineers are pretty familiar with those exercises and pretty happy just doing them again and again and again. But all too often, I see the glutes and the hamstrings really being neglected in mountaineer strength training. So just try to keep in mind a really, really simple rule is for every single exercise you do on the front of the legs, which are predominantly working the quadriceps, balance it out with an exercise on the back of the legs. So something like a step arm, a deadlift, a hip thrust, or a leg curl. That's a super, super, super simple training principle, but too many mountaineers overlook this, too many mountaineers don't do this, and that can make a massive difference. Now, when we're getting into specifics around exercises for knee pain, there are a few that I very highly recommend, no matter what situation you're in. An absolute must, which is probably my favorite exercise in this situation, is an exercise called the step down. So basically, this involves you standing on a small step and then slowly dropping one foot down the floor and then back up and repeating that nice controlled. If you're not familiar with that exercise, plug it into YouTube and you can check it out there. Now, this is probably my favorite exercise for knee pain, purely because it is really, really close to exactly replicating a descent while hiking. And it's so effective at improving knee stability and really, really making sure your knee knows what it's doing when it's going downhill. Now, I know many mountaineers out there might scoff at this humble exercise if you do plug it into YouTube and you're like, oh my gosh, that looks incredibly easy. But you can make this exercise harder by increasing the height of the step, adding some weight, or progressing it to a bit more complicated exercise. But that's such an important starting point for so many mountaineers, and I highly recommend if you're not doing that training, put it into your sessions, and it will make a difference after a while. A few of my other favorites include things like mini band walks, which I do pretty regularly in my warm-ups, single leg deadlifts, hip thrusts and glute bridges. All of these are super effective in this particular situation. And if you're not including all of these in your workouts, I highly recommend you get on them. And even someone who's not dealing with knee pain, all of those exercises are going to be incredibly effective in improving your performance on the mountain. And they're exercises which I do not see enough from with mountaineers. So again, if you're not familiar with any of those exercises, plug them into YouTube. There'll be a million videos and you can check it all out. So the final question of this strength training is, how much should you actually be doing? In general, I usually recommend mountaineers aim for about 2 45-minute sessions each week. You don't really need to be spending more time than that. If you're programming right, you can fit everything you need into that time frame. You can get away with doing less, but as an optimal thing, you probably want to be aiming for 2 45-minute sessions. If you did want to fit in a little bit more, at most you might do a few extra low-load exercises as a warm-up before your other workouts. So before your runs or before your hikes or before your hill intervals or anything, you might do mini band walks or terminal knee extensions or a few step downs or something like that. But in all honesty, you probably don't need to be doing so much more. So step number 2 when it comes to preventing knee pain for hikers, for mountaineers, I should say, is strength training. If you're not applying it and you're not doing those exercises I recommend, I highly recommend you get around it. Now, factor number 3 and step number 3 is exercise choice. And what exercises you're choosing for your training can make a really major difference to your knee pain. Now, a few of the things I'm about to mention is more or less common sense. And if you hear this, you might think, you know what, why wouldn't I be doing this? But as the old saying goes, common sense isn't common. And so I am going to be very, very clear about this. So choosing particular exercises and choosing particular training methods is really, really effective and really, really essential when you're dealing with knee pain. A classic example of this is lots of mountaineers love to run, and they love to do running, whether it's on the concrete, whether it's on the trail, whether it's whatever. And running can be an amazing way of developing aerobic capacity. In particular ways, it can be a great way of developing your muscular endurance, and it can be a really, really good thing. But if you're dealing with knee pain and you're running 5, 6, 7 times a week, that's probably not a great idea. Quite often I'll recommend for a lot of my mountaineers, if they are purely focusing on running and they're suffering with knee pain, is subbing out 1 or 2 sessions a week for cycling. This is still going to be developing aerobic capacity, still going to be developing relevant muscles for mountaineering, but it's a lot nicer on your knees. Now, the argument goes, a lot of people in the mountaineering world will say, look, cycling's okay, but it's not specific and it takes longer to get the desired results. And, that is true. But when it comes down to it, if you're trying to prevent knee pain, cycling is going to be your friend a lot more than running. So that's an area you might want to look at. And that's something that's so common I see with mountaineers. Another thing is taking away exercises in the gym which aggravate your knee and which put undue and unnecessary pressure through your knees. So classic examples of this is just jump training and, doing things like box jumps and squat jumps and lunge jumps and doing lots and lots of repetitions of this as a mountaineer. I know a lot of people like to use this as muscular endurance training, as circuit training, but it's just not a really, really effective way. Well, it can be effective. It's not a very smart way of going about this training. If you're dealing with knee pain, box jumps, squat jumps, lunge jumps, just don't do them. There's so many better ways of developing muscular endurance. There's so many better ways of developing cardiovascular adaptations than doing those exercises and those high impact things. A few people might hate me for saying this, but it's just not necessary. And don't get me started on burpees. And I'm not going to go into that. But box jumps, squat jumps, lunge jumps, and burpees, get rid of them. If you're dealing with knee pain, they're not helping you at all. And then finally, when it comes to exercise choice, have a think about your downhill loads. As I said before, downhill hiking, downhill running can play a pretty big role into knee pain, and there's a lot of force going in there. So you just need to be wary of how much downhill and particularly how much loaded downhill you're doing. So if you're trail running or running on the streets, you might consider, if you're dealing with knee pain, just if you do come to steep descents, run, get to the descent and then do a quick walk down and then continue running. You might be hesitant to do that. It might feel a bit wussy and a bit, half-assed, but it can be pretty effective. The most important thing when it comes to downhill loads is if when you are doing your hill or your stair interval training with a loaded pack. Now, we all know that's an amazing way of developing muscular endurance, in which you sort of go up a super steep hill with a whole bunch of load on your back, get to the top, return down the bottom, do it again. Really, really good challenge for the legs. But that downhill portion, if you are walking with a load on your back, it can really, really stress out your knees. So 2 great options here if you are doing this type of training. Number 1 is do the classic water jug carry, which is recommended by the guys at Uphill Athlete, in which you load up your pack instead of with weights or with sand or whatever you're doing, but load it up with water jugs or a dry bag full of water. Do your climb, get to the top, empty all your water out, then go down the bottom and refill and repeat like that. That way you'll get the stimulus going up, but you won't have to get that extra overload on the way down. Can be a bit of a hassle, but it's very, very smart training for anyone with knee pain. And the other option is, if you can't do this, is doing stair intervals in an office block or an apartment. And you're just climbing up the stairs, but instead of returning down, you get over to the elevator, take the elevator down the bottom and repeat. So you're purely just doing that uphill. Now, those 2 training methods are an incredibly smart method of training for anyone who has any history of knee pain, because it gives you that option to get as much stimulus as necessary on the way up, but it takes that force out of your knees. And there's probably many other changes and many other swaps when it comes to exercise choices for knee pain. But the simple thing is, if an exercise hurts, find an alternative. There's 1,000,001 ways of going about any type of training. You don't have to be hooked on one type of exercise or one type of training because someone recommends it. There's always another way. So be smart there. Use your common sense, even if it isn't common. And then the last point I want to talk about today is simply workload. As I said before, mountaineers just love just doing too much work. They're just doing too much training, and they just live this endurance athlete's mindset. I've got to train every single day. I've got to run every single day. And that you do, if you are doing a massive peak coming up, you do need to do significant amounts of training, but you need to be smart with your workload. You need to make sure you have a gradual build up. You need to make sure you're giving yourself recovery days. You need to make sure if you have a week or 2 off, if you go on holidays, if you do a climb, if you get sick, that you don't just return to your normal training load, but you gradually ease yourself in. All of this plays into your training. And if you don't understand your knee pain, I should say, and if you don't understand how to manage your training load effectively, that's when you need to reach out to help from a coach who can do that and get the outside perspective. Because 9 times out of 10, when I see from mountaineers, in my opinion, they just do way too much workload because they just love throwing more sessions and throwing more training and hoping it'll get them fitter. But you got to be a bit smarter than that, particularly if you're dealing with pain. So I won't dive into that too much, but that's something you need to be aware of. Now, on top of the points I've mentioned so far as mobility, strength, exercise choice, and workload, there are a huge amount of other factors which do play into knee pain or pain in general. There's body weight, there's pack load, there's sleep, there's nutrition, there's hydration, there's stress, there's other lifestyle factors. There's so many other things which play into this, and it is a subject which I could talk about for literally days, and it is something that I very much will be talking about further on down the line. But these 4 things are a great place to start. Get on top of your mobility training if you need it. Get on top of your strength training no matter what. Make sure you're choosing smart exercises and manage your workload. Put those 4 things into action, and I guarantee it'll make a major difference to your knee pain, no matter what type of pain you're getting and no matter what type of diagnosis you're getting from here. And I highly recommend you really have a think about this, because knee pain is such a hassle. It sucks so much enjoyment out of the process of training. It sucks so much enjoyment out of your time on the mountain, and potentially it can really get in the way between you and success. So take it seriously and get on top of it. Now, we've covered a whole bunch of information today, and I understand if you may be feeling a little bit overwhelmed. If you were interested in learning how to apply this type of training into your life and into your weekly routine, and sort of get an insight into how certain exercises work and what particular techniques you can use to help alleviate knee pain during the process, I do have something for you. A little while ago, I put together a little 5-day challenge, and it's called the 5-Day Hiker's Knee Challenge, which is specifically designed for adventure athletes who deal with knee pain on the trail. Now, this challenge is designed just to give you a bit of an idea around the particular exercises and how to do them and how to apply them into your life to make sure you're moving with free pain, and also gives you a reasonable amount of education around some particular strategies, tactics, and tips that you can use to overcome your knee pain on the trail. Now, if you want to find out a little bit more about this 5-day challenge, it runs every single week from Monday to Friday. It costs a big $5 to participate in, and you can join up at summitstrength.com.au/5-day-challenge. I'll leave the link in the show notes below, but if you were struggling with knee pain and you want to get a bit of an insight into how all this information I've talked about today works, you can check that out at summitstrength.com.au/5-day-challenge. Check it out, get involved, and it really will make a big difference over the long term. So thank you so much for listening today, guys. I really do hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've got a bit of value out of it and got a little bit of insight. If you do have any questions about this, feel free to reach out to me anytime at rowan@summitstrength.com.au. As always, if you have enjoyed this episode and you felt like you got some value out of it, it would mean the world to me if you can leave a review and a rating at whatever podcast platform you're listening on right now. It really will go a massive way of helping grow this podcast, reach more mountaineers, and make a bigger impact in your training moving forward. So thank you so much for listening today, guys. Have a lovely day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.